Night of the Witches 1. Kapitel 5. Sojiro returned to his apartment on foot as per routine, under a blanket of clouds in the night sky. The rusty stairs of his apartment building clanged with each step. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see the bicycle parked by the apartment building's outer wall. He debated the pros and cons of a bicycle, how much easier life would be versus the expense, the convenience versus the necessity, but in the end decided one was not right for him just now. Clutching the bag of apples under his arm, he took out the key to his residence. He tilted his head in confusion. More and more he found himself preoccupied with such random thoughts, when the real issue at hand was deciding what to do with the apples he had received. He placed the paperback by the sink and switched on the light. It was just after 10 in the evening. With the end of term exams just around the corner, he had come home an hour earlier than usual. As he made back for the kitchen to pick one of the apples to snack on, he found an envelope stuffed in his mail slot. The envelope had no name, return address, or stamp. Inside was a single piece of paper that had only the sender's name and a short message. It read,
話があるので、今夜どこそこのここに来られたし、大事なようなので、来るまでずっと待っている。
Mist. A concise set of orders, neatly written. It was signed Aoko Aosaki. She had been considerate enough to enclose a detailed map of the meeting place. Puzzled, he cocked his head to decide, then headed out the door. Afterward, upon the room's sole tenant leaving the premises, the envelope burst into flames and evaporated without a trace, as though it had never existed in the first place. Oh yeah. By the late 80s, Japan's post-war economic boom had somewhat stabilized, and the city experienced a period of steady growth. The city's modernization marched on, and the Japan Railway train station, a symbol of the new era, neared completion. In Misaki's neighboring town of Yashirogi, a new symbol of its own was about to be born. Yashirogi bred Enkitsi land. It was Misaki's worst investment. Years later, it would be dubbed the fool's gold of the economic bubble, a relic of a bygone age. 10 years ago, Yashirogi's renowned Tokitsu banking company ran factories across the nation. Its proprietor was a middle-aged gentleman, then aged 56, by the name of Yurihiko Tokitsu, known affectionately by most as Topan. He took it upon himself to begin development on an estate on the outskirts of Yashirogi, and broke ground on a recreational wonderland that he hoped to be the pride of Misaki City. The long-awaited opening came in 1981. After 3 years of investment, this local amusement park, full of all kinds of hopes and dreams, began its short-lived tenure. It covered more than 85 square acres. Its magnificent merry-go-round dazzled all who passed through the park's gate. Its roller coaster twisted and turned about the edges of the park like a writhing Japanese dragon. Its Ferris wheel, packed beyond necessity with gimmicks, was said to have tested the limits of modern engineering.
完璧だ。遊園地に必要なものは全て積み込んだ。
Old Yurihiko looked upon his creation and smiled. Only boosting his confidence was the fact that its grand opening was staged during a period of prosperity, the springtime of the world. But in spite of this, they splendidly miscalculated the balance between aspiration and sophistication. Its mascot, Kätzchen, was poorly designed and appeared like a cheap knockoff. The park was stuffed to the brim with bread stands. Even its impossible-to-navigate mirror maze seemed out of date from the start. There are no dreams to be had at Kätzchenland, only nightmarish satire. Numerous trade magazines lambasted Kätzchenland's shortcomings, and customer attendance declined. There was even an incident where a 6-year-old strayed from his mother, had an accident and nearly died. 1986, 5 years after the park opened, the situation had grown from bad to worse, and the park was hemorrhaging money. On top of everything, Yurihiko, who had bet everything on the success of mascot Kätzchen, retired, and Kätzchenland's operations were officially in trouble. And thus, amidst the scorn of nearly all residents of the area, ended Misaki City's one and only amusement park. What's more, perhaps best described as a footnote to this debacle, the self-proclaimed Parisian artist who designed the mascot, Toki Jülich, was said to have snapped his brush in mourning over the closure of the park. Returning to the present. It was midnight at the Kätzchenland of today was shadows of its former glory. Like a doll abandoned in the corner of a toy box, the lonely park was illuminated only by the light of the town that continued to live around it.
なるほど。
Soichiro closed the Yashirogi guidebook that he had picked up on the way here. The story of its history was almost difficult to believe, but he supposed this was what people referred to as entropy. The park's front gate was unlocked. When he worked here the previous time, the iron fence was locked shut with a rusty chain, but the chain was nowhere to be seen, and the gate left ajar. Following the map drawn in the letter, Soichiro quickly made his way inside.
急ぎのようなんだろうけど、こんな夜中に何なんだ一体。
Du bist zu glaubwürdig. Soichiro complained, quite out of character for him. It was probably because, in spite of his naivete, even he knew that something was amiss. Though the park was abandoned, this was still trespassing. Unlawful entry, larceny, burglary. These were certainly not things, or perhaps crimes, that Soichiro was proud to do, but...
すまない。お金は払えないんだ。ただで入って申し訳ない。
Money. The real reason of his conscience was gnawing at him. He clapped his hand in apology towards the statue of Kätzchen, on whose eyes the paint had begun to aptly dissolve. Soichiro passed the mascot bleeding red paint from its eye sockets and began to walk the night park. The building's colors had faded. The collection of machines was rusted. The man-made residents no longer felt the passage of time. Even the ghosts themselves could not endure the disparity between this forsaken place and its previous grand stature. It was like a fossilized dream. These were the ruins of a paradise both created and abandoned by man and reality. The economy had stabilized, and the standard of living was on the rise. Nobody was overly concerned with the future. These were the remains of a wild and exciting era. His breath turning to white wisps before him, Soichiro continued through the abandoned amusement park. Though void of human presence, this was not nearly as frightening as the darkness deep in the mountains. City suburbs can take many different forms, but Kitsyland was unusual for an amusement park in so much as it had been built adjacent to a residential district. The park was surrounded by a forest, but even that ultimately was man-made. It was no different from the curtains on a classroom's window. If he were to scale the iron fence encircling Kitsyland and break through the 20 yards of afforested trees, he could make it back to the familiar townscape. Though the amusement park tended to arouse dread in the city folk, to Soichiro it was little different from the commotion and terror of downtown. The central plaza was as silent as a grave. According to the map, the meeting spot was west of here. Waiting for Soichiro at his destination was a rugged, imposing, magnificent castle towering before the backdrop of the cloudy night sky. Even for an abandoned park, it was a remarkable structure. If the roller coasters and the Ferris wheel were loud, intense attraction, this was in comparison quiet and easygoing. It was one of Kitsyland's 3 iconic structures, and in a way the wicked fortress that guided this paradise down the path of closure. Generally speaking, amusement park mazes generally fell into one of 2 categories. A labyrinth, which disoriented its visitors with its sheer size, and a house of mirrors, which disorients visitors with optical illusions. Many of our labyrinth's guests enjoyed the brief sense of adventure that it afforded. Over the years, however, it would be usurped by the ever-increasing thrills of new attractions. Such is the way of all trends, the curse of fads. The new must give way to the newer. On the other hand, the House of Mirrors was a time-honored, beloved staple. Even within the confines of a classroom's dimension, well-placed mirrors and well-directed light could both perplex and delight its visitors. And figuring in the cost of maintenance, a well-designed house of mirrors could far outlive its labyrinth brethren. Even if both types faded in obscurity, they would remain a staple of what constituted an amusement park. However, that didn't mean combining them would produce double the fun. Together, they transformed from entertainment into an uncanny realm from which those who dared to step within could never leave. In a similar sense, Kitsy Mysteries Tour Castle was the park's very own overworld. Indeed, 5% of visitors end up requesting staff assistance to get out. Modeled after European castles, it was greater than a football field in length, and the interior was further split into 3 floors. Himmel! Das war ja echt ein Spinner, der das erschaffen hat. 2 floors above ground and 1 below, lined with mirrors from top to bottom, equal parts complex and vast. The maze demanded at least 30 minutes even from veterans. One visit was all it took to be struck by catoptrophobia of ours. It was this labyrinth that now stood in Sochiru's way.
真っ暗ってわけじゃないな。電気とかついてるんだろうか。
It seemed that Sochiro, unaware of what a house of mirrors even was, concerned himself only with its lighting. He checked the letter from Aoko once more. The letter read, "I will be waiting in the first floor lobby of the House of Mirrors." That meeting place was definitely there. There was something to see by at least, as he could just make out light faintly through the open doors. Putting aside his suspicions, he headed towards the entrance. The sound of his steps against the brick-laid path echoed faintly. He was far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The park's clock no longer made tick nor tuck, and the winter's bite no longer blew in the night. From within the silence, the stillness that would cause any onlookers to hold their breath. Sochiro stopped abruptly at the entrance to the House of Mirrors.
ところで青崎、そんなところで何してるんだ?
He called out, turning back towards the plaza. Oh my god. A sound rang out as if someone had dove behind a garbage can, and it fell to the ground in their haste. A short silence ensued. For a moment, the abandoned park returned to its previous hush. Resigned to her having been exposed, the girl appeared from her hiding place.
Oh.
His voice died in his throat as he took in the sight of the girl's familiar face in unfamiliar attire. This Aoko, with her long hair flowing in the breeze, was different from the Aoko that Sochiro knew. The resolute stance and posture she took exuded the strength of her will. She stared directly at him with a sharp-eyed, piercing gaze. Her eyes were glowing with a dim, phosphoric light, enough to give Sochiro pause that he might be hallucinating. An icy coldness and a girl's strength. Sochiro lacked a sense of danger, but the sense of imbalance caused even him to feel the malice in the air. It was as though the Yuki-onna spirit of folklore had climbed out from a ghost story and appeared here in reality.
Aozaki.
Ren! Instinctively, Sochiro took a step back. Mach mehrere Schritte, du musst rennen! Surprised, he was starting to feel concerned. An unpleasant premonition rose to the surface, bringing with it a sense of anxiety. In spite of this, he felt obliged to honor urban etiquette by seeing if she was all right.
その顔を見るに何かあったのかと一応聞いておくんだけど。
Without acknowledging him, Aoko took a step forward. Her figure, this atmosphere, Sochiro found himself recalling a recent memory. Oh boy. His twisted and knotted apprehension melted away and was replaced with a growing realization. The girl before him was very similar to someone he had seen before. That night in the park, though he had only seen her from behind. With increasing certainty causing him to swallow nervously, he noted that they might as well have been identical.
何をしていたかって話なら見ての通りよ。 ここで獲物が通り過ぎるのを待ってたの。あなたが入ってから私も入って逃げ道をなくすつもりだったから。
Aoko said perturbed by the swift change in plans.
そうか、待ち合わせ場所は合ってたんだな。
Oh my god, das ist ein einziges Problem. Soichiro was mightily relieved he had not gone the wrong place. It was unclear whether he felt confident about dealing with what was to come, or if he had simply failed to grasp the hopelessness of the situation. Aoko ignored his obtuse response and continued.
私はね、しずきくん。嫌いな人とか憎い人とかは人並みにいるんだ。ただ、ちょっと変なのが敵になるやつの条件でね。
Cold emotion burned in her eyes. Her feet had already moved one step closer to Soichiro. Soichiro's sense of foreboding was growing stronger. Wondering if what he sensed was bloodlust, he retreated another step. Continuing as so, they maintained a distance of just 15 feet.
昔から私は嫌いな相手でも敵と思ったことはなかったの。でも逆に好きな相手を敵だと思うこともあった。理由は単純。
She held her right arm out. The light about her was no illusion.
当たり前のことだけど、私の感情を乱すやつが敵なのよ。
Her arm moved again. It was instantaneous. Something shot past Soichiro in the blink of an eye, missing him by just a foot to his left. Before his eyes, a blue light, something akin to a fireball, had ignited from nothing. He finally understood what was happening.
ちょっと待った。今のは大変見覚えがある。
She ignored his dim-witted reaction.
外したか。
Aoko muttered to herself. The fist-sized hole the blue light had made in the house of mirrors crackled and smoldered. A shot like that could easily cave in a human skull, in addition to burning it to a crisp.
ああ、こんな射程で外すなんて、アリスに見られたら自殺者ね。でも、これで分かったでしょ。二度目だもんね。あなたにとっては。
Soichiro backed away swiftly. Things were beyond incomprehensible. He was close to losing the ability to think at all. All he could make out was the figure of the dependable student council president, or at least what he had thought was the president, and the memories of the park that night 2 days ago. He had never experienced anything like this, though most people living in a civilized country would have never seen anything like it either. A lethal weapon that could kill with nothing more than the pull of a finger had a way of suspending the ability of its target to determine between not just good and evil, but dreams and reality, past and future. And the more peaceful someone's life had been, the stronger that suspension was likely to be. All that one could think about was the fact that they were alive at that very moment. It was as if he was an unwritten character on a blank piece of white paper. There was no before, there was no after, there was only what came next. This was a very common thought process for anyone staring down the barrel of a gun.
あ、命乞いはやめてね。意味ないから。でも、恨み事ならご自由に。殺す側の義務として一言一句聞いてあげる。
Ice cold. By saying it was pointless, she made it sound more like she would not listen to what he had to say. However, Soichiro was in such a state of shock that it did not even enter his mind to speak up. All he knew, for reasons unknown, was that the girl in front of him wanted him dead.
嘘つきにも程がある。飛び丸のバカ、何がそんな生き物はいないだ。実際いるじゃないか、こんなお化けみたいなのが。
Fair zu sein, er hat dich vor ihr gewarnt. Soichiro felt that if he had said that out loud, the second blast would come even quicker than the last. So he kept it to himself. His mental expletives steered his mind from paralysis to mere panic. His response came not from confidence, however. Someday, out of the blue, someone is going to kill me. While it may have seemed like a baseless belief to hold.
そうだった。都会には殺人事件がある。ルールを破れば殺されるのは当たり前だって、ちゃんと教えてもらってた。
So Soichiro, the situation seemed too perfectly to align with his inexperienced understanding that the city was a coldly pragmatic place. As far as he was concerned, in this moment, being killed by a classmate was not something to be surprised by. In a society where murder was possible, he was able to accept this sort of situation as natural. Or virtually no concern was the series of events that led to Aoko's aggression towards him. The only thing that truly confused him was Aoko's blue fireball. Soichiro swallowed with an audible gulp. To anyone who may have been watching, it was the response of a victim paralyzed by fear.
そういうことよ。ようやく理解してくれたわね。多くは語らないけど、あなたにはここで死んでもらう。魔術は隠匿するものなんて言っても、そっちには関係のないことだし、単に運がなかったって思えばいいわ。大事なのは私があなたを殺したってことだけだから。
Done talking, Aoko once again lifted her right arm. There was a hum like a machine. Blue light began to revolve about her arm beneath her sleeve. This was taking longer than last time, leading Soichiro to believe that it was going to be much stronger than the attack that was still scorching the wall behind him. The realization caused his panic to heighten.
いや、なんだ、つまり始末するとかしないとか、あの夜のお化けは青崎だったとか、都会は本当に込み入ってるとか、そういうことじゃなくて。
His thought became jumbled. Er kennt die Kirche? His heart pounded like a hammer. This was no time to be standing still. He was not sure if the girl in front of him was really human, and more importantly, even if he could accept the events unfolding before him. When all was said and done.
待て、人殺しはいけないんだぞ。
Okay. Even if it was a fact of life in the city, Soichiro was not about to lie down and die.
分かってるわよ、そんなことは。
Soichiro's scream, still entirely oblivious, was just the thing to invoke Aoko's full wrath. Aoko fired a barrage of blue magical bullets. In an instant, Soichiro dashed into the shadows behind him, into the entrance to the House of Mirrors. He darted feverishly down the hall. After a mere few feet, he was left completely out of breath. This was due to his shock at seeing yet another attack, fiercer than the first. that he'd never seen in his life, and because he couldn't shake the thought that if he had moved even a second later, he would be dead. He could not afford to stop. The sound of merciless footsteps closed in behind him.
けど助かった。ここならなんとか。
He threw everything into his legs as he sprinted. A straight, narrow passage about 60 feet long connected the entrance to the main lobby. At this rate, if he could just make it to the lobby, he was sure he would be able to find as many hiding spots as he needed.
助かった。
He arrived in a large open space. This was the first floor lobby. There were 3 passageways. One led to the basement floor, one connected to the first floor maze, the other was a set of stairs leading to the second floor. Soichiro did not particularly care which one he chose, so trusting his intuition, he made a run for the first floor maze when he smacked his head into a transparent wall.
鏡？
ええ、面倒だけど、それならフェアでしょ。追いかける方にも逃げる方にも有利不利がある。
A somehow cheerful voice echoed in his direction. There was no need for Soichiro to even turn around. In the very same mirror he had crashed into, he could see Aoko Aosaki's figure slowly approaching.
それと、1階の奥にある出口は封鎖しといたから。結界じゃなくて物理的に。やりすぎて封鎖っていうより瓦礫？土砂崩れ？どっちでもいっか。とにかく下手に出口に近づくと崩落に巻き込まれるから。生き埋めが嫌なら近寄らないことね。
Panicked by the impending footsteps, Soichiro groped for the wall. He could see the stairs to the second floor. He did not understand what Aoko had meant earlier, but he at least knew that the first floor was not going to save him.
ま、私としてはそっちのが助かるけど。形式上、事故死の方が後始末とか楽だから。
Behind him was a creature beyond words. As she continued her idle taunting, she lifted her right arm, ostentatiously. Even from above her clothes, one could see some kind of strange, incongruous pattern upon her body. The magic crest. The vein beneath her skin. They made it seem as though something inhuman was circulating her body. Whether out of pity or repulsion, Soichiro stopped for just a moment. His pursuer evaded his gaze.
ああ、これ？普段は塗り薬で隠しているんだけど、今日は特別。魔術刻印って言ってね、魔術師の証みたいなものよ。ほら、光が回ってるでしょ？これがさっきのスナップ。わかりやすく言うと弾丸の元。今日は調子いいし、私魔力を効率よく使うのだけは自信あるし。うん、あと30回ぐらいかな。さっきみたいな装着ができるのは。
Perhaps she was on an emotional high, for her voice had become frightfully friendly. The substance of the conversation could not have been any more unsettling, however.
そもそも何を言っているかよくわからないんだけど、青崎。
わからない？段数はあと30発ってこと。そこまで逃げ切ればあなたの勝ちよ。とりあえず今日のところはね。
今日はって明日もあるのかな。
Soichiro knit his brows. Aoko's expression creased into a scowl at his behavior. Although he was panicking, it seemed that deep down he still did not feel the full weight of the crisis. She knew he still didn't get it.
宣言はしたわ。自由時間はこれでおしまい。まだ罵り足りないだろうけど、ま、その手の時間はキリがないしね。この辺りで諦めて。
It appeared Aoko had prepared this theatralic dialogue ahead of time, not to allow her opponent time for futile pleading, but to give him the time to curse her, his killer. Such forthrightness was her modus operandi. With this victim, however, it was not going as she had hoped.
とにかくそういうことだから。じゃ、狩りの時間と行きましょうか。
Her voice was void of emotion, and her eyes ruthless as they bored into her prey. This time, Soichiro finally accepted that he was going to die. Silent as the dead, it stepped into the remnants of a dream that had long since seen no visitors. There was no wind this night, nor a soul to be seen. Still, it heard the echoes from within, clasped its hand together and grinned. Its form, with hands clasped, resembled that of a budding tulip. The bearing of its artificial flower reflected in the cloudy mirror of the ticket attendant's office next to the gate. Next to it stood a display board, corroded by years upon years of rust. No. Number of visitors today, 2. Number of today. The board had graffiti crudely scrawled atop of the words. It was replaced with deaths. The records board had long ago fallen to disrepair. After taking a full 10 seconds to digest what it was looking at, it made its own revision. Number of visitors today, 3. Number of deaths today, 1. After appending this number with her index finger, she smiled like a flower. Then she began to walk towards the source of the sound. It had been 10 minutes since this rhapsody had begun to echo from the House of Mirrors. The amusement park's entrance returned to as it was before, soulless. Dritten Besucher. In the end, even if Soichiro had been the luckiest man alive, there was no way he should have been able to escape. The question, however, was how much of this was by design, and how much was sheer coincidence. Even Aoko, who had made all the arrangements, had no answer. Indeed, there were only 3 things she could say. It was taking longer than expected. He was putting up more of a resistance than she had anticipated. And that choosing the House of Mirrors was a mistake. She had really screwed the pooch on this one. The location itself was an excellent choice, as the House of Mirrors was perfect as a hunting ground. But seeing her own incompetence reflected in the mirrors was beginning to grate on her. The moment Aoko's right arm began to glow, Soichiro made a beeline for the staircase in front of him. A strobing series of blue flashes lit the room behind him. The hunter calmly followed her prey, and the prey desperately ran for his life up the stairs.
注文通り。そうでなくっちゃお膳立てした甲斐がない。
The stark contrast to Soichiro's frenzied escape, Aoko walked briskly up the stairs. She elected not to run after her prey in order to maintain a set distance. As she lacked confidence in her accuracy, the hardest thing for her to deal with would be if he charged right at her and went down fighting. But at a distance of 30 or so feet, he posed no threat. By the time her prey drew near, she could fire 10 shots and hit with at least 4 of them. Their positioning just a moment ago hadn't been ideal. At that distance, in a space that opened, if he flanked and rushed her, there was a chance, however small, that it could turn into a fistfight. Currently, Aoko's best weapon was the bullets from her right arm. If she was going to capitalize on that advantage, it was in her best interest not to close the gap between them. If there was a good time to approach, it was only after her prey had become exhausted and had lost the will to continue. Would she pierce his leg, shoot him in the back? Or perhaps would he just give up after losing himself in the labyrinth? The hunt would end when her target sustained some sort of injury and became unable to run. On Sojiro's end, he could barely bite back on screaming as he bolted through the maze. Even running in a straight line had become difficult, much less searching for an exit. The corridor stretched out far before him. Also, the mirrors blocking the path had made it seem. Panicked, he made a turn to the right. Clutching his head in his right arm, Sojiro led with his left, groping through the air to see whether a wall was there or not. He dove down the hall to the left, narrowly dodging the bullets targeting his life. Urged on by the sound of approaching footsteps, he ran without thinking. The last one was close. A hair closer would have meant his life. He caught the odor of burnt hair from the back of his neck. He was very lucky. Or perhaps very unlucky. If he were actually lucky, he would not be in this situation in the first place. The second floor of the House of Mirrors was structured like a giant spiral. It went left, starting from the outside wall. Eventually, it would lead to a dead end. The more he tried to escape, the more cornered he would become, as though he were trapped in a twisted guillotine. His stifled screams threatened to leak out as complaints. No matter what he did, he was going to be killed. All of his struggling merely served to prolong the inevitable. Yet he ran. No matter how many mirrored walls he rammed himself into, he ran. Even after crashing so hard that his forehead bled and he saw stars, he ran. Pain shoot through him at every turn. The more frantically he ran, the more intensely he smashed into the invisible walls. His body began to understand this rule and begged him not to run anymore. His breath was already ragged after sprinting a couple hundred feet. No matter how he thought about it, this was not normal. This was way too crazy. This was all just a bad joke. If he turned around now, she would apologize to him for taking it too far. His mind had gone blank. As his body continued to slam into the mirrors again and again, his feet slowed as they began to believe that perhaps it really was all a joke. But then he felt a chill, a touch of death upon his neck. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Sojiro knew this kind of terrible chill far too well. Ever since he had arrived in the city, he had come face to face with more than one or two near-death experiences. For someone who did not understand city life, his present predicament was not unlike when he experienced the traffic on the streets or the commuter rush on the station platform. he was far from an innocent babe, unable to comprehend life or fear. Rather, everything he had ever known became irrelevant when he was flung into a completely different cultural sphere. Even society's promise of safety, something urbanites took for granted, were threats to unknown. So he was used to this already. Though if he were to be honest, he was dissatisfied with some things. Things superfluous to necessity. His world was overflowing with valueless things, and they were all dangerous in some way. Even the everyday necessities sold at a convenience store were, as far as he was concerned, amazing tools. Civilization had raised the standard of living so high that it had numbered humanity's sense of danger. The city's constant pursuit of wealth and convenience was a poison to a country boy like Soshiro. And he did not have the capacity to accept these conveniences. That it was possible for such conveniences to easily and suddenly be misused and cause unintended accidents had always made him anxious. Why? He had to wonder why he was even here. How ironic. It took the real threat of death to finally make him realize, like a divine revelation that he'd failed to understand until now. He'd always had to expect the unexpected. Near-death experiences were more common than one might think. To begin with, safety was something that came up at a price. Being alive meant that the opposite was always lurking around the corner. It was just like a streetlight at night. When the sun rose, its illumination would naturally disappear. Another barrage of strange projectiles whizzed mercilessly by him. He recalled in the back of his mind the charred remains of someone at the hands of that blue flame 2 nights prior. Somehow, the situation reminded him of a horse being led by a dangling carrot. For now, he lifted his head and continued to run through the labyrinth. Ja, du bist die Karotte. But for what purpose? Though he knew the pain in his chest was very real, he felt disconnected from it. The night sky, visible through the skylight, was a muddy, ultramarine, no longer resembling the one he knew. And managed to calm himself. Sochiro began to laugh in despair, as though something rather precious had been broken. Everything had become meaningless anyway. Even so, his legs somehow made their way forward at the sight of her reflection in the mirror. Like a game of cat and mouse, Sochiro fled through the labyrinth of mirrors. Then, after 4 minutes, that strangely unreal tension ended. The 9th shot of blue light hit inches away from him. It exploded the moment it made impact, launching Sochiro into the opposite wall. Of all the fire he had taken thus far, this shot indisputably brought him the closest to death. Groaning, he collapsed to the floor. His back was on fire with pain. He was not bleeding and was lucky he could still even scream. Yet his body refused to move. Physically and mentally, he still had something to spare. The pain was not so bad that it was preventing him to stand up. It was just that there was a skylight above him, and he could glimpse the dark of the night sky beyond. The feeling that overcame him was a raw, selfish bout of grief. It was just so cruel. To have to stare at that for the remainder of whatever short life he had left. Sochiro's ragged breath slowed. For all intents and purposes, he had given up. He had given up running away from the sound of pursuing footsteps, and perhaps even the problem at the root of everything.
まあ青崎に殺されるならいいかな。
Sochiro's Shizuki felt things that in any other circumstances he would never feel. Incidentally, without exaggeration or embellishment, this was the only mistake he had ever made in his entire life. Starting vacantly into the night sky above, Soichiro listened as the footsteps drew nearer.
Give up?
English. It was the closest her voice had ever been to him. Perhaps feeling that he really had given up, she approached his collapsed form. In the dark, mirror-lined corridor, he could not make out her expression. Without a word, Soichiro raised his eyes to meet his murderer.
返事がないならそれでいいけど。調子狂うわ。普通どうして殺そうとするのかぐらい聞くものじゃない？
Aoko spoke from within the shadows. His eyes widened in bewilderment. Now that she had mentioned it, he realized that would have been the obvious question to ask. He had more or less picked up on the fact that he was being killed for learning some secret, but it was human nature to want to know more.
そっか。それはそうなるな。
A simple affirmation. His face was a mixture of resignation and forlorn longing. He thought for a moment before...
でも言う必要はない。聞きたくないんだ。そういうのは。
He responded in a mature, subdued voice. His response was clear, rather gallantly so.
そう。じゃ、殺すけど。死ぬの怖くないの？
怖いに決まってる。何より痛そうだ。
His face turned wry as he objected, to which Aoko frowned. Nonchalant as he could be, he was honest about his feelings.
そりゃ怖いでしょ。私だって怖いと思うし。でも悪いわね。我慢して。人でなしと罵ってくれて結構よ。今の私は本当にその通りだから。そういった意味じゃあんたと同じ。普通の道徳がないのよ。だから必要なら人も殺せる。
Soichiro's finger twitched in response to her indifferent tone, as if to say that, despite having given up on just about everything, his body could not let those words slide.
人殺しなんて良くないぞ。
分かってるって言ってるでしょ。
Aoko raised her right hand. The light from the crest illuminated her face. It goes without saying that her expression was unchanged. She was not crying, nor was she smiling. She was a young woman who had excised her feelings. Deal with it was another thing Soichiro could not let slide. Soichiro could read on Aoko's face that she was not herself. She was in pain, and to a degree he had never seen in her.
すまない。ちょっといいかな。
何？ここまで悲壮感を盛り上げておいて、やっぱり逃げるなんてのは却下よ。
He unconsciously smiled at Aoko's ruthless counter and breathed a sigh of relief. He had misread the pain he saw in her face. This was the same Aoko. Soichiro laughed out loud in genuine joy, a laugh that most other people would have taken as an insult.
遺言でも聞いてあげようと思った私が甘かった。っていうか、今の小バカにした笑いがあんたの遺言ってことで OK？
いや、そうじゃなくて、あそこにいる人は 青崎の友人なのか？
Uh-oh. Out of nowhere, Soichiro pointed behind Aoko.
はあ
Aoko thought that it must have been that old, overused distraction technique. If this had been a Japanese comedy act, this would be the part where she gave him a whack with a paper fan. But after giving it a second thought, she realized Soichiro didn't have the capacity for understanding old or even new tricks.
あんた何言って。
Perhaps his honest disposition had been to his benefit. Without thinking, Aoko gave in to her curiosity and turned her gaze towards the direction in which his finger was pointed. And there. Something that should not have been there in the maze. Something with a creaking wooden smile. It was the ominous, creepy, uncanny figure of a girl. Noch ne Puppe.
人形